My name is Justin, and I am an addict. I have been actively working the steps in the rooms of recovery since September of 2013 and am grateful to be sober one day at a time thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts. RECO12 is an organization with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addiction of all kinds and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. Speakers from our past meetings have represented many fellowships and identify with addictions and diseases with such variety as alcoholism, drugs, food, sex, gambling, and theft, just to name a few. Each Friday at noon Central Time, we hold a live lunch hour speaker meeting with a recovering addict from anywhere on earth, pertaining to any or no faith tradition and with any background, who shares their experience, strength, and hope on a specified recovery topic of their choice. They share for 20 to 25 minutes on that topic, and then the live audience has the opportunity to ask questions of that speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. Before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I just want to do a quick follow-up on plans for RECO12. Once again, beginning on March 4th of this year, just in a few weeks, about a month from now, we will start a 12-week series on each of the 12 steps of recovery. I'm searching for people who are absolutely passionate about one of the 12 steps and come from any and all fellowships of recovery who would like to share with us their experience, strength, and hope on that step. The basic format will be the same, 20 to 25 minutes on the share, and then 20 to 25 minutes of Q&A focused on the step of recovery of their choice. If you or someone in your fellowship is passionate about that step and just seems to share about that particular step and the power of that step in your life, please consider reaching out to me at RECO12pod@gmail.com. That's RECO12pod@gmail.com. And we'll discuss it and get it scheduled. Get in quickly if you'd like to be one of these guest speakers. They're filling up quickly. Now, donations and reviews are always greatly appreciated, and details on doing that will be in the chat of the live meeting and in the show notes of the podcast. We look forward each week to receiving the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now, let's introduce our guest speaker for the 87th RECO12 meeting, Cristine P., whose topic is A Ladder of Love, Raising Frequency Through Recovery. Now, here's a little bit about Cristine. Cristine recently celebrated 33 years of recovery. Cristine has a professional background as a licensed therapist, substance abuse professional, and specializes in holistic mental health. She has authored books and created training programs to facilitate frequency shifts like those she has experienced as a blueprint for others. She has also crafted her story of transformation into a fictional series, which she plans to launch this year. Take it away, Cristine. The floor is yours.
So I am so grateful to be here and to be back in this recovery atmosphere. Even 33 years later, I'm still passionate about recovery and about this process of evolving. So if there's one word I would tie in with recovery, it's progression. And so in my story, my spiritual awakening began in the late 80s. I'm a recovering addict. Cocaine addiction was actually my drug of choice. And as I experienced this night and day transformation, my experience was the light came to this dark life I was in. And it was through my invitation. I am Christian. My spiritual awakening was through Jesus Christ. And I've maintained that center throughout, decades of, I would say, spiritual progression. And I now consider myself quite eclectic spiritually, but that has remained a constant. And so to just kind of explain this concept of a ladder of love is, so I would say the first 10 years of my sobriety and recovery, I stumbled around. I searched. I spent that 10 years actually in Al-Anon. I went to AA meetings. I went to NA meetings in the beginning. And I actually figured out that something was going on in these meetings that was triggering me. if we look at really my drug of choice, it was the addict. And so I ended up marrying an alcoholic and addict, and wanting to, there was an energy in that was still addictive to me, even though I was clean and ended up sober in that time period too. But that addiction to the addict was what kept me from progressing further. And so I ended up going to Al-Anon, and that's where I found my sponsor finally. In my story, my pride was also a really big obstacle to my recovery. And there wasn't a perfect sponsor. And finally I started to realize, oh my gosh, I actually married my drug dealer. This is another, in my fiction novel, I go through this process. He was actually a very compassionate, empathic individual. And that's what drew me to him. Used substances to kind of tone down his sensitivity. And I realized, I'm pickier about picking a sponsor than I was about a spouse. And 8 years into Al-Anon, I realized I still don't have a sponsor, and people are asking me to sponsor them, and I can't really say yes. I was leading meetings, but it took me till the end of that decade, in my first decade, to finally get a sponsor. And I don't recommend delaying that. I really don't. So it took me a year, and I worked with that sponsor for a full year, weekly meetings, stayed on step one as long as I thought I was going to go. I was like, I kind of liked this idea of, I'll do a step a month. Let's do that. I was still on step 1, 8 months in because I had not released control. I had not surrendered the deeper layers of what really was keeping me stuck. And so a lot of times in the frequency model, we'll evolve, and we'll get this experience of like running into a wall, beating our head against a wall, spinning our wheels. Something is just not getting better. And, at that point in time, if I looked back on my life, I had moved from a very dark lifestyle, and drugs, and didn't have a lot of boundaries around, my relationships and my sexuality, into a monogamous marriage, reactivity into my church, into my faith, and a dedication to routine. Routine is very important. And so really what had happened is I'd moved from what in this frequency model would have been a 100 frequency to a 200 frequency, which is where kind of like the 100 is just, really dark. You see that frequency in a lot of people that are incarcerated, actually. And I did start working in a jail, and I got that vibe there. But a 200 is kind of like where you're caught between dark and light, and you've got to make a decision. And sometimes that's where an addict is, and they spin their wheels at that 200 frequency until they make a commitment to get out of that stuckness. I'd made that commitment. And so I'd moved through that level, at least in certain areas of my life, with my decisions, my behaviors around substance use. And I was no longer using substance. In fact, I quit chocolate for 5 years. I can't believe I did that at this point in time because I couldn't do it again. But I was working on refining my physical being during that time period in a way that I was more adherent, I think, to principles of health and wellness than the average person. So I was definitely evolving in my frequency there. But then I had this relationship, and this relationship was conflicted and messy. And, my husband at the time would go to the bar and sometimes not come home until Saturday, Friday night, payday, you go to the bar, and I wouldn't see him until Saturday. And I would spend that time just in a state of emotion, not happy emotion and loneliness, and, started raising kids, and then it was stress, and it was fear, and so these emotions continued to be a lower frequency in my life, and they were triggered by this relationship. So it took me finding a sponsor. It took me being willing and raising my faith enough to start depending on God. So back to the frequency model. At a 300 frequency, you have solid routines. You're one of the good guys. You're serving in society. And I was serving in my Al-Anon meetings, and I was part of supporting the positive life and change of others. And at that point in time, I also was a substance abuse counselor. And so as a substance abuse counselor, I was also trying to make a difference, trying to share spirituality and recovery with others. And so the only problem is that I was a little bit in rescuer mode. And codependency is definitely a little higher frequency maybe than addiction, but still not where we want to live. So that was the challenge at that point. So back to this beating your head against a wall, running into this block. What I found is that every time you do a frequency shift to a next level, it takes a pause. You can't just keep doing what you've been doing and expect different results. What do they call that, right? The definition of insanity. And the one thing we do want is this, the serenity prayer is, we gain our sanity back, right? So let me just with this definition of frequencies, I was shown a map. And in this map, it was like there were 7 levels of progression. Okay. So before I started using the calibration numbers, I understood these 7 levels of progression. And I'd already achieved the 4th level by the time I saw this map. And then I was able to look at my life and say, oh, wow, this is where I've been. And I had a sense of where I was going. And so later I discovered a man by the name of Dr. Hawkins, who calibrated frequency levels. And I realized that his frequency calibrations matched with these 7 levels of progression. Another book out there, if you're curious in understanding this, it's called Spiritual Progression in the Last Days by Blaine M. Jorgensen. And he also talks about 7 levels. So in this model, I'd reached this 3rd level, this 300 frequency, and I was doing good things. My behavior worked, but my life wasn't working. And so what had to happen is another change had to happen within me. And it was a change that happened. They talk about turning you from the inside out. So behavior change is good, but then there is something better. And that was the next level. So this 4th level, this 400 frequency, is where I had to surrender and my heart was broken. And as I released this marriage, as I released dreams that I had that my husband would get sober, something would change in him, that we could be a family, it broke my heart. It truly did. And so that heartbreaking process, I guess, opened me up to experiencing a level of faith and a connection to God, a dependency on God more than on the things that I was clinging to at that point in time. So I ended up single. And that's actually, it was during that era of my life. So we're going into now decade 2 of recovery. I learned about the concept of second stage recovery. And that's another principle that you might be able to find some of these principles around. That in second stage recovery, it's like you've established sobriety, you've established, commitment to a path, but your life is messy. And you might be going through a divorce, and you might be going through mental health crises, and you might be going through, trying to now resolve another issue in your life, like finances. And so what I started to understand is that I might be in recovery from this one area or 2 or 3 areas of my life, but then there's 4 and 5 and 6 others. And I had to keep using those same 12-step principles in each of these areas. And what I started to see is that my life would improve by these steps and it would progress. So this loss happened, and I continued in my recovery, and it started to get lighter. It started to get less heavy because I was no longer now trying to drag, an alcoholic spouse around or someone who was resistant to recovery. And I took off, which was amazing. So I started grad school during that second decade of my life, of my recovery. I started working with higher principles. And I love this. Someone's mentioned the holistic approach. Yes, absolutely. I started working with a holistic approach to healing my life. I attracted people and trainings and experiences in that were the next level, and that started to heal my emotions and my trauma and my financial situation, and all these things started to work in multiple areas. But that was when, so I was a teacher in, a local jail here, teaching substance abuse principles and other things. And that was the time frame that I started to understand this map. So I got information about the map from the book I mentioned. I also got the same 7 levels, and it was in the same week. Kind of a weird coincidence. Well, it wasn't just coincidence. It was synchronicity. And I was working with a book that talked about energy healing. And in this energy healing book, they also mentioned 7 levels. And what was interesting is that these 7 levels correlated with basically the body is one level of healing, and lower frequencies are part of our denser experience, moving all the way up to the spiritual, where you've got higher frequencies and your spiritual body is lighter and finer. So it started to kind of make sense that we're actually a being of frequencies, plural. And so if we can work on our health frequencies, that'll lift us. If we can work on our emotional, that'll lift us as well. So in this process of evolving, learning these principles, I then discovered there's a 5th level. And I understood that that's what I was moving into. And the trick, and I will tell you, this is the trick, is you have to leave your ego mind behind to get to the 5th level. So the 4th level is a lot about healing emotion, the energy of yourself. The 5th level is kind of more about healing your mind and healing this, the stuff going on in your head. And this really, so I have to tell you this cool synchronicity experience, and it's something I attracted. By this time I was in the second marriage too. So a lot of things had evolved for me. So I had moved away after my divorce and then went back. It was probably 10 years since I'd met with that Al-Anon sponsor. Hadn't seen her, heard from her. And I'm out on a walk and boom, there she is. Run right into her practically. But we're going in opposite directions. And she's moving and I'm moving. So we spend 5 minutes, if that, just catching up over the last 10 years. And so she tells me, and so I'd started to explore the idea of mindfulness at this point in time. And this was, I knew this name. So she had actually followed Thich Nhat Hanh. So Thich Nhat Hanh is I would say, Buddhist teacher. And a lot of people have heard the Dalai Lama. Well, I kind of would say there's the Dalai Lama, and then, a few steps below is Thich Nhat Hanh, but very close in frequency, if you want to call it that, or as a teacher. So that got my attention. And then she mentioned there was a monk in her basement, which is actually the title of an upcoming book. There was a monk in my basement. That one got my attention. So this Al-Anon sponsor had moved from 12-step models to meditation training with the originals, with the masters of these principles. And I knew I needed to meet with this monk. Now, he did, there was something called a Buddhist Sangha in our community, and I just wasn't comfortable. I couldn't do Buddhism. Like, I was a Christian, right? So, but he did offer consultations. So I went in to meet with him as a consultant, thinking he's going to help me with mindfulness, which I'd learned from a client about and discovered, mindfulness is actually Buddhism in Westernology. So I went to meet with him to learn more about mindfulness, and that changed my life. I remember standing at the door of my sponsor's house and realizing when I walked through that door, things were going to change. I was going to go another step up. And there was some fear about that because the unknown is uncomfortable. Just like anybody's found in recovery, when you know what you know and you've been going in that path or that, going around in those circles, that's comfortable. I knew I was going to get out of some circles. And what those circles were the circles that were going on in my head, in my mind, my thinking. And so in this first session with Monk, I did learn to practice meditation and stillness and silence. And most people struggle with meditation and stillness and silence because their minds are active, their bodies don't know how to be still, and they're typically running from something. So in recovery, I found that that's usually the number one issue. We're trying to escape something. That something might be shame. That something might be an issue in our relationship that we don't want to face. It might be a trauma from our past or an experience from our childhood, or it's something. And so as long as we run from that something, the head is programmed to keep running. The body doesn't want to necessarily be still. And everybody's wired a little differently. And so that shows up differently for different people. But to be still and to be silent, for me, it almost felt like it was scary. And as I continued that practice, what was going on inside of me started to surface. And then I could see it. And I wanted to run from it. But I did end up in a Buddhist Sangha, and I was there at a 30-minute meditation session, and I couldn't run from it because I knew if I'm not going to interrupt all these people. And that was the most important thing I needed. That was so important in my recovery, that I sit with myself. And so, long story short, that ended up becoming a career for me. Now my I guess recovery program looks like this meditation practice. That's what I do. I don't actually do it with the Buddhist Sangha. I've actually developed something that's a hybrid of what I call the Eastern mind and the Christian heart. And, and I've created some groups around that and some programs around that. And I found as long as I do that, because I can't just teach people and tell them, oh, do this. I have to do this. It's the same principle I found in recovery is like, you've got to do recovery. You've got to be sponsored in order to sponsor. You've got to go to meetings in order to make a difference in people's lives. That's a very different principle than what I learned in, as a mental health therapist. And I brought that recovery principle into the mental health world as much as I can, and hope to teach others and open up this importance of the recovery model as we're trying to do any level or type of healing. And really what it is it's evolving. And like I use this, this ladder of love, which is the idea is that every step on that ladder is meant to be a loving experience. Clear back when I was in the darkness of my deep addiction, I had an opportunity to turn myself over to a higher power. That was a living experience. In the middle, when I was in that 300 frequency and I was struggling with the painful relationship and dead ends, the loving experience was the potential I had to evolve and awaken at the next level. And so I think, what we realize is that, oh yeah, that wall, it's not a wall, it's a step. It's a step. And the only way to get, because that step is taller than we are, The only way to get up that step is to turn over our will and our, and our lives to the care of God, who then lifts us and opens up opportunities to move us to the next level. And so the good news is that this fifth level, this is where the inner peace shows up. The roller coaster levels out, and that peace becomes more of a constant. And so if the peace is in your mind, the love is in your heart, that combination, that's what, in this model is a 500 frequency. That's where life works. Like if you can get there, keep going. And that's what I would say, is that there's potential for relapse all along that way. I could have, given up at any point. And sometimes we do relapse and then we can get back where we were. But that keep continuing on that progression model does get us where it's worth getting to. So that's most of what I wanted to share today. And just the invitation to, I've got some things available. I'm sure there'll be kind of links and things that my goal is to educate and teach these principles in different, like I said, arenas, including the mental health field, to support some of these shifts and to support real healing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cristine. And yes, as you mentioned, we will post any links that you share with me through the email on the show notes. I'm going to have that the podcast up like within an hour after we close this up. So just email those to me right after we're done here, and I'll get those in the show notes, so that if anybody here is listening live, if you want to get those links, just look at the podcast show notes when it comes up and you can get to those. Thank you so much, Cristine, for sharing your experience, strength, and hope, and what you've learned over the last 33 years about this. We've had a few questions come in, and I've also written down several questions. A reminder to our live audience, if you have additional questions, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to those and ask those as we go along here. So before I get into that, if you could share, Cristine, just a little bit. It sounds like Al-Anon is your primary, your fellowship of choice. Tell me a little bit about how fellowship in Al-Anon helps you on a day-to-day basis.
So yes, Al-Anon, and I would say for 10 years was my fellowship. It supported me to start to think differently. And this is what was so interesting, is when I went and ran into my Al-Anon sponsor, and then I started to hear some of the principles. For example, in Buddhism, they talk about letting go of attachment. In Al-Anon, they use the term detach with love. And they're really basically the same thing. So detach with love means that you don't allow another person to control how you're feeling, how you respond to things, what, your experience, that you get them out of your boat. So I use the analogy of a boat a lot of times in this, the metaphor of recovery, and a boat with only one oar is spinning in circles, right? And sometimes people want to attach to a boat that's downstream. If you think about a stream that's on a slope, and I show people a stream on a slope, and I say, which direction is recovery? If you're in the middle, which direction is recovery? And everybody knows it's upstream, you got to row, right? And so I think I was born basically with one oar, okay, not two. So the oars represent works and faith. I had the works oar. I got really good at doing and behaving in the ways that worked. And then I plummeted because it didn't work. Not completely, not without the faith. And so Al-Anon is where I found my faith oar. And it paralleled with my reactivity into a church, a Christian church of faith. And I needed kind of like both legs to be able to walk forward, the Al-Anon leg of faith and, the religious leg as well. And so that's really what I got from that 10 years is learning how to live with faith and not, I guess, not feel like I had to be a rescuer, because that was the other one, is that, attaching my boat to somebody else and rowing didn't work either, because, that person didn't, created resistance. It actually made me really strong, but it created resistance that got in the way of my own recovery.
Thank you very much. All right, now we'll get to some questions, additional questions here from the live audience, from myself. And I'm going to combine a few questions that have come in from a few of our audience and myself. We all have similar questions here. If you could take a minute and just define a little bit more about frequencies. Is it similar to vibrations? Is it, how do you define frequencies? And are there like specific milestones? Hey, I'm moving from a 200 to 300 here because I have crossed this specific milestone.
Right. Okay. So it is a calibration of, I would say it's similar to light frequencies. And so if you look at light, you have a different wave at red. Okay. So red light has a different wavelength than purple, which is they're different hertz, different frequencies in that regard. But then music is another one. And so these sevens are really interesting because there's basically seven colors of the rainbow that show up in different hertz or frequencies. And there's 7 notes on the piano. And, a lower note holds a different frequency. It looks different if you were to analyze the sound pattern than a higher note. And I don't know how many octaves there are. That would be interesting to look at, because you definitely feel the difference in a really low octave versus a really high octave. So that we see frequencies all over in nature, but people that kind of tune into this, it is you're tuning into a vibration. And so Dr. Hawkins basically outlines emotion on a frequency scale. He calls it the map of consciousness, I believe. But emotion is definitely something that shows up in a frequency model. With the lowest frequency emotion is actually shame. And one of the highest frequencies is peace, and gratitude are very high. And then there's all these things in between. And so there's definitely negative emotion, which tends to be below 200. So that 200 mark is kind of this line in the sand, with everything below 200 being negative and everything above 200 being positive, and more positive as you progress. So these, like you said, these steps, for me, it took a true miracle to get out of a 100 frequency. It often does. And
you mind sharing that true miracle with us?
Yes. Oh yeah. Because it was, it's basically that that's my fiction novel. And so I'm trying to decide whether to give away the whole, it's like a spoiler, but the true miracle was basically a change of heart, a complete transformational change of heart that happened. And it took me, a year of basically delving into addiction to say I was probably an addict by the end of that year. And I was controlled, it felt like, by this, almost like an entity that I would want to say, eat something. I remember this one point in time where somebody came over and I just made dinner, and they pull out some meth, and I can't eat first. And I know if I use that, I might throw the food away, because I'm not going to be able to eat for 12 hours. So, it wasn't like I could make my own decision. I lost my power. And so it was a total surrender of my will that happened over a course of several weeks, to the point where I couldn't sleep and I couldn't eat. And there was a point in time when I finally did say, all right, I will change my life. And in response, I heard the voice of Christ say, thank you. And everything within me it's beyond this life's, explanation. It definitely came from the spiritual realm. but I was completely transformed. And the next day I didn't have any desire. I left my, the drug dealer, but I did, I told him we have to get married now, 6 months later. But anyway, the complete transformation was instantaneous. And those are principles actually in the 600 frequency of instant healing. So it took a 600 frequency or more to transform. And that's a principle in this, to transform a really low frequency or a complete, the darkness.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of that story, of that miraculous situation. Now, you mentioned earlier in your share a little bit about phase 2 recovery. We have a question that came in from one of our live audience members, Shalina. She asks, where can we find more information about phase 2 recovery? I have the words, but not where to find more information.
Okay, let me see if I can find it's actually called second stage recovery. And there was, I believe, a book about it. Let me just see if I can find. It looks like Stage 2 Recovery, Life Beyond Addiction by Ernie Larson. Might be one that, and I think that's the one. I recognize that name, I think. And so that might have been, because it was actually clear back in 2000 that I found this, but this might be another edition. So.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else about stage or stage 2 recovery, second stage recovery that you would like to share with us that you have learned in your own walk?
So yes, I'm trying to think how to explain this. I discovered, so when I was teaching in the jail, I wish I could tell you where it came from. It was just like it showed up one day. I didn't even know where it came from, but it gave 4 phases of recovery. And the first phase, and so I think this will be helpful. The first phase of this was bottoming out. And I thought that was really interesting. So that was really what changed me, was I had to hit bottom. The second stage of recovery is ambivalence. And so when I was talking about like the 200 frequency, it's like where you're kind of torn between, do I change or not change? And so you might kind of go back and forth, or you might quit halfway, or you might like quit one thing but not another. So it's like you're not quite there. And in AA, they say half measures of avail does nothing. That's ambivalence right there. Okay, you're not going to get further if you stay in ambivalence. The third stage of recovery is, and so actually these aren't the same stages, but in this other model, the third is commitment. So commitment is what opens the door to go forward. And at the same time, you've got to almost barricade that, if I show this on the stream, it's like you've got to barricade everything below you on the stream so that you can't go back. And then you have to go forward. And that commitment, that could be your whole recovery. That could be where you live, is just in that commitment. But then they do explain this 4th level. And I believe they called it integration. And so if I can find out where that comes from, I will. But in the integration phase, you're trying to figure out now, who are you if you're not an addict? Who are you? Or what else needs to change in your life? And that's where I was like talking about, sometimes mental health challenges come up. Sometimes you got to change relationship patterns. You may have to change jobs. But really what I started to figure out at that point is that was where I started to see the map beyond 300 frequency into 400 and 500 and 600 even, is that it wasn't just there that change happened, but it would keep going. And so that I think might be helpful to kind of understand too. And maybe I can find some ways to connect, if anybody wants to email me, please, let me kind of put some things together and get that back to you.
Perfect. We'll put your email address in the show notes. Thank you, Cristine. Another question came in from our live audience. This is from Cheryl. Cheryl asks, and there's a little story behind it. So the question comes first and then the story. So what helps when you are hit with the shame frequency? As an Al-Anon and an ACA, I can feel overcome with shame when I perceive potential rejection or feel I have looked stupid and start judging myself. It hits like a freight train sometimes. Even though I have serenity and have had a full psychic change in many areas of my life, for example, relationships, food, money, etc., through working the steps rigorously. So back to the question, what helps you when you are hit with the shame frequency?
That is a big one. I actually use a technique called EFT, emotional freedom technique. So this works with when I was talking about kind of this understanding I learned about the bodies, the different frequencies we actually have an energy body. So we have a physical body. That's what's talked about in Western medicine. And in fact, in Western medicine, they use cadavers to understand who we are, but that's missing something, is it not? It's missing our life force energy. And so that life force energy is part of our second body, our energy body, or vital body. And so there's techniques that actually release emotion through the vital body. And those are the most powerful techniques. So some examples, emotion code is one. Some people work with Reiki. That's not my thing because I don't want to work on somebody else's energy as much as just let them work on their own energy. And so emotional freedom technique is what I ended up. I got certified in it, or I was trained in it 20 years ago. And now I certify other people in it because I love it so much. It's like, I found the power of this. So there's, and it's hard to do by audio, but there's a way to actually, if you would take the side, so you take your palm, okay, and then you hold it vertical, not so that your thumb is up and your pinky's down. And then you do a karate chop. So you take your palm and you then karate chop your other hand. And what this does is it's stimulating a meridian called the small intestine meridian. And that runs through your hand that you're chopping with, through your pinky. And as you're chopping, you state this, and this is a powerful phrase. Even if you just use this phrase, it's huge. Even though I have this chronic shame, or this shame returns, I love and accept myself completely, as you're tapping, with infinite love and gratitude. I release and forgive. You take a deep breath in. You can now you stop tapping as you breathe in. You find that shame in your essence, in your being, and you exhale it with everything in you. And you keep exhaling and keep exhaling and keep exhaling. And you'll even feel, if you're working with your small intestine meridian, what you want to do is feel your abdominal, low abdominal area push out that air, that energy. And we can do it again, because if you do it 3 times, it's even more powerful. I think we have time. Okay. So as we're tapping, so again, do your karate chop. And as you're tapping, you say this, even though this chronic shame comes back, and notice the shame, notice it if it's there, feel the vibe of it. Even though this shame comes back, I love and accept myself completely. With infinite love and gratitude, I release and forgive. Take a deep breath in as you hold your hand now. Just hold it. Find it and let it go. Let it go all the way from your solar plexus and your deeper abdomen. Let it go, let it go, let it go. And it's here, and it's in that exhale. If you keep the exhale out, you don't breathe in for a minute, sometimes you'll find the quantum silence, the sacred silence. And that's this indication that an energy has been removed. And it's really powerful. This works with some very high frequency principles, because you've got to have that, like I said, that really high frequency to shift the low. And then what's even better is to fill in that. You don't want to leave a void. So you can actually take your fingers and tap them across the top of your head, starting your forehead. and just tap back to the base of your head. And you spread out your fingers and you just tap back. And this is a different meridian, but it's called the governing meridian. It's where your thoughts can be shifted. And just use a different statement, which is, I am ready to let this go. I'm ready to let this go. I allow this to be taken from me, because sometimes you can't. I allow this to be taken from me. I am enough. That would be a powerful one too. I'm enough. I'm loved. That's really big. That's a big one. So, and just, statements like that, if you can keep those in your body, those hold frequencies. So love is one of the highest frequencies there is. And if that can replace what was a low frequency, you got it.
Awesome. Thank you for walking us through that. I really appreciate that. I wrote down those phrases and that practice. So I'm going to give it a shot the next time I get hit with the shame energy that drags me down.
Yeah, it works really well on fear also. Anything that's intense, that you can feel it. The vibe of it. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's very helpful. Before we close down, do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us?
I would just say, like I said before, keep going on the journey. And there's, and recognize when you're running into something or you feel like you haven't gotten anywhere, that pause, do the silence, do the stillness, and surrender and imagine it's like a vertical solution. It is, you want to go straight up. And what'll happen along that process, and this is actually in the third book of this series I'm working on, is aligning. It's an alignment. And so the further you get on the journey, the more aligned you get with God frequency. And it's just an ongoing process. It takes our entire lives. We're going to always be in recovery. I'm sorry if that's not what you want to hear, but I think people in 12-step programs get this better than most because they have to, right?
Right. And I'm a believer that I get to walk this path for the rest of my life, one day at a time, until I'm safely dead. And I'm actually now I am grateful for that. The first couple of years of walking the path, I did not want to hear that. And that did not sound appealing, but the miracle happens. And I think that for me, that's the message for that concept that you just shared the rest of my life. Don't give up before the miracle happens, because the miracle will happen if I don't give up. Awesome. Anything else before I do a closing reading and then we go into the prayer?
I did see a comment about a natural and necessary byproduct of learning is to teach. That has been that's been so important in my, I would say beyond even second stage recovery into those, the 400 and 500 frequency. When you get into the 400, 500 frequency, that is absolutely true. Because the other thing that happens at those higher levels is that we become channels almost for others to hear what they need to hear, for, even teachers, like, as in, you could show up and therapists and different things like that in professions. But yes, absolutely. Teaching is, I think, it's an important part of the recovery process, and to give back,
I agree that step 12 principle is really powerful. Thank you so much, Cristine. That was a very good RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. To our live audience, or to those listening, if you have questions that you still would like to ask, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions there that will come up. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you have not yet rated or reviewed the podcast in Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you use, I invite you to go do so now. It's a great way to work step 12 and sharing this message with others. Next week, we will hear from Kathy McEl, who has been active in the rooms of OA, NA, Al-Anon, and emotional sobriety meetings for 47 years. Her topic will be Keep Coming Back No Matter What. And I look forward to hearing her experience, strength, and hope in our conversations that we've had so far between Kathy and I. It sounds like she's quite the firecracker, so there should be some good energy there. Now let's launch off into the rest of our day with the prayer of St. Francis that Cristine will be voice for. Go ahead, Cristine, yes, when you're ready.
Lord, make me a channel of thy peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds. It is by forgiving that one is forgiven. It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen.
Amen. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when I work it, so work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching for glimmers of light, feet still on the ground. I can still be found, standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and bind it with the sea.